The red dust of the Texas Panhandle swirled around Fiona Murphy's boots as she stepped off the stagecoach, her freckled face hidden beneath the wide brim of her bonnet. Whisperwood Creek, 1873, a town that promised nothing but represented everything she had left. After her father's passing and the foreclosure of their small farm in Missouri, this distant cousin's offer of shelter was all that remained of her prospects. "Mind your step, miss," the coachman said, handing down her weathered carpet bag. "Whisperwood ain't much, but it's something." Fiona nodded politely, though her throat felt tight with apprehension. At 22, she was neither young enough to be considered fresh-faced nor established enough to command respect. And then there were the Freckles' countless copper specks scattered across her nose and cheeks like stars in the night sky. In Missouri, they had earned her endless ridicule. She had no reason to believe Texas would be any different. The main street stretched before her, lined with false-fronted buildings typical of a frontier town. A general store, saloon, small hotel, and various other establishments competed for space along the dusty thoroughfare. Horses were hitched to posts, and men in varying states of trail wear moved about their business. A few women in calico dresses hurried along, baskets in hand. Fiona took a deep breath, adjusted her bonnet to better shield her face, and began walking toward the address scrawled on the wrinkled paper in her hand. Her cousin Martha owned a small dress shop and had offered Fiona room and board in exchange for help with the business. It wasn't much, but it was a new beginning. "Excuse me," she asked an elderly man sweeping the boardwalk outside a barber shop. "Could you direct me to Whisperwood Dress Emporium? It should be owned by a Martha Calloway." The man nodded, pointing down the street. 3 buildings past the Silver Spur Saloon, right side. "Can't miss it, got fancy cloth in the window." "Thank you kindly," Fiona replied, gripping her bag tighter and continuing her journey. As she passed the saloon, the doors swung open, releasing a cacophony of piano music, laughter, and the clinking of glasses. A group of cowhands emerged, their spurs jingling against the wooden boardwalk. Fiona lowered her head and quickened her pace, hoping to avoid notice. "Well, look what the stagecoach brought in, boys," one of them called out, his voice slurred with drink despite the early hour. "We got ourselves a new face in town." Fiona kept walking, eyes fixed on the path ahead. "Hey there, pretty lady, no need to rush off," another voice called. A third cowhand stepped directly into her path, forcing her to stop. "Let's see what you're hiding under that bonnet," he said, reaching for the brim. Before she could react, a strong hand caught the cowhand's wrist. "That's no way to welcome a lady to town, Hank," a deep voice said firmly. Fiona looked up to see a tall man in a worn leather vest standing beside her, his grip causing the drunken cowhand to wince. He wore a Stetson pulled low over his eyes, but she could see a strong jawline shadowed with a day's growth of beard. "Mind your business, Jackson," the cowhand muttered, pulling his arm free. "Treating folks with respect is everyone's business," the man called Jackson replied evenly. "Now, why don't you and your friends head back inside before you embarrass yourselves further?" The cowhands grumbled but backed away, stumbling back toward the saloon doors. "Thank you," Fiona said quietly, adjusting her bonnet which had slipped back slightly in the confrontation. The man turned to her fully now, and she got a better look at him. He wasn't young, perhaps in his early 30s, with lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested years spent squinting into the sun. His eyes were a clear blue that reminded her of summer skies in Missouri. "Jackson Wade," he said, tipping his hat politely. "Town Marshal." "Welcome to Whisperwood Creek." "Fiona Murphy," she replied, still clutching her carpet bag like a shield. "I've just arrived to stay with my cousin, Martha Calloway." Recognition flickered across his face. "Martha mentioned you were coming. Good woman, your cousin, runs a fine establishment." A slight breeze caught Fiona's bonnet, pushing it back just enough to fully reveal her face. She quickly reached up to adjust it, but not before she saw the marshal's eyes widen slightly as he took in her freckled complexion. Embarrassment burned in her chest as she waited for the inevitable comment or poorly concealed laugh. It always came, sooner or later, but Marshal Wade only smiled a genuine smile that reached his eyes. Let me escort you to Martha's shop, Miss Murphy. It's the least I can do to make up for your unpleasant welcome. They walked in silence for a moment, Fiona hyper-aware of the occasional glances from townsfolk as they passed. Small towns run on gossip, Miss Murphy, the marshal said suddenly. By sundown, everyone will know there's a new face in Whisperwood, Fiona sighed. And by tomorrow, they'll all have something to say about it, I'm sure, he glanced at her curiously. About what? She gestured vaguely toward her face. These, my Freckles. They tend to be quite the conversation piece. Marshal Wade stopped walking and turned to face her directly. His expression was puzzled, as though she'd said something perplexing. Miss Murphy, he said finally, folks around here have plenty of real problems to worry about: drought, cattle rustlers, and whether the railroad will ever come through. I doubt your Freckles will cause much of a stir. There was no mockery in his voice, no hidden amusement in his eyes. Just matter-of-fact sincerity that momentarily left Fiona speechless. Here we are, he said, gesturing to a neat storefront with Whisperwood Dress Emporium painted in elegant script across the window. Behind the glass, several lengths of fabric were artfully displayed alongside a mannequin wearing a fashionable blue dress. Thank you, Marshal, Fiona said, finding her voice again. He tipped his hat once more. A pleasure, Miss Murphy. Should you need anything during your stay in Whisperwood, my office is just down the street across from the bank. As he turned to leave, Fiona gathered her courage. Marshal Wade, he paused, looking back at her, thank you, not just for the escort, but for being kind. Something warm flickered in his eyes. Kindness costs nothing, Miss Murphy. Remember that about Whisperwood. With that, he continued down the street, nodding to various townsfolk as he passed. Fiona watched him go, a strange feeling settling in her chest, something between relief and hope. Perhaps Whisperwood Creek would be different after all. The bell above the shop door jingled as Fiona entered, announcing her arrival. The interior was neat and well organized, with shelves of fabric bolts lining one wall and ready-made items displayed on the other. A counter with a sewing machine stood at the back, where a woman in her 40s was carefully pinning a pattern. Be with you in just a moment, the woman called without looking up. Martha, Fiona ventured. It's Fiona Murphy. The woman's head snapped up, eyes widening in recognition. Fiona. My goodness, is it 2 o'clock already? She set aside her work and hurried around the counter, arms outstretched. Let me look at you, child. Fiona accepted the embrace somewhat stiffly, still adjusting to the idea of this relative she barely remembered from childhood visits. Martha held her at arm's length, studying her face with undisguised curiosity. You have your mother's eyes, Martha said finally, smiling. But those freckles, those are pure Murphy. Your father had them too, God rest his soul. Fiona felt a lump form in her throat at the mention of her father. Thank you for taking me in, Martha. I promise I won't be a burden. I can work hard. Martha waved away her words. Nonsense. We're family. Besides, I'm desperate for help with the shop. These old fingers aren't as nimble as they used to be, and the town's growing. More ladies wanting proper dresses means more business than I can handle alone. She gestured toward a doorway behind the counter. There's a staircase there that leads to the living quarters upstairs. I've prepared the spare room for you. It's small, but it should be comfortable enough. It sounds perfect, Fiona assured her, grateful for any space to call her own. Go on up and get settled, Martha urged. Rest a bit if you need to. That stagecoach journey is brutal. We can talk more over supper. Fiona nodded gratefully and made her way to the stairs, her legs aching from the long journey. The room was indeed small but clean and pleasant, with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a small window overlooking the main street. She set down her bag and moved to the window, watching the activity below. Across the street, she spotted Marshal Wade speaking with an elderly shopkeeper. Even from this distance, there was something compelling about his tall figure and the easy way he carried himself. She watched as he helped the old man lift a heavy crate, then tipped his hat in farewell. A decent man in an indecent world, Fiona thought. Such a rarity deserved note. She turned away from the window and began unpacking her meager belongings. Tomorrow would be her first full day in Whisperwood Creek. A new beginning required a good night's rest. The following morning dawned bright and clear, with sunlight streaming through Fiona's small window. She dressed quickly in a simple brown dress, pinning her auburn hair into a practical bun. After a moment's hesitation, she decided against the bonnet. If she was to live and work in Whisperwood, hiding her face would only postpone the inevitable. Martha had breakfast waiting, hot biscuits with gravy and strong coffee. "I open the shop at 8, she explained as they ate. "Most days we close at 6, except Saturdays when we stay open until 8 for the working women who can't shop during the week." "What would you like me to do first?" Fiona asked, eager to prove her worth. "I thought you might help with inventory today, get familiar with what we have in stock. Then perhaps this afternoon you can assist with customers while I work on Mrs. Billings' wedding dress. Her daughter is getting married next month, and she's insisting on the most elaborate gown Whisperwood has ever seen." The morning passed quickly as Fiona familiarized herself with the shop's offerings. Martha was an excellent seamstress, and the quality of her work was evident in every garment. By noon, Fiona felt reasonably confident she could assist customers. The bell above the door jingled, and Fiona looked up to see a group of young women enter the shop. They were approximately her age, dressed in fashionable attire that marked them as daughters of Whisperwood's more prosperous citizens. "Good afternoon, ladies," Martha called from her workstation. "Fiona will be happy to assist you today. She's my cousin from Missouri, just arrived yesterday." Fiona summoned a polite smile. "How may I help you?" The leader of the group, a blonde woman in a blue dress, stepped forward. "I'm Florence Thorpe. My father owns the bank." She said this as though it explained everything about her. "We're looking for fabric for new dresses. There's a social next Saturday at the Wilsons' ranch." "Of course," Fiona replied, leading them to the fabric display. "Did you have a particular color or style in mind?" As she showed them various options, Fiona became increasingly aware of whispered comments and stifled giggles behind her back. It was a familiar sensation, one she'd hoped to leave behind in Missouri. "Is something amusing about the calico?" she asked, turning to face the women directly. Florence exchanged glances with her friends before responding. "Not the fabric, dear. We were just noticing your unique complexion. Does the sun always affect you so strongly, or were you perhaps caught in a pepper mill explosion?" The other women tittered at this, hiding their smiles behind gloved hands. Fiona felt the familiar burn of shame but squared her shoulders. "These are Freckles, Miss Thorpe. I was born with them." "How unfortunate," Florence replied with false sympathy. "Perhaps we could recommend a good face cream. There must be something to minimize their appearance." "I find nothing unfortunate about my appearance," Fiona said evenly, though her heart pounded. "Now, about the fabric, Florence, aren't you being unkind?" interrupted a softer voice. A dark-haired young woman stepped forward from the back of the group. "I think her freckles are quite distinguishing." Florence rolled her eyes. "You would, Josephine. You always did have strange tastes." She turned back to Fiona. "We'll take 5 yards of the blue cotton. My father will settle the account at the end of the month, as usual." Fiona nodded stiffly and moved to cut the fabric, grateful that Martha had shown her how to operate the large shears properly. As she wrapped the purchase, the dark-haired woman Josephine approached the counter. "Please forgive Florence. She believes her father's position gives her the right to say whatever crosses her mind." "It's quite all right," Fiona replied automatically. "I'm accustomed to comments about my appearance." Josephine frowned. "That doesn't make it acceptable." "I'm Josephine Wilson, by the way. My family is hosting the social next weekend. You should come, both you and Mrs. Calloway." Before Fiona could respond, Florence called from the doorway. "Josephine, are you coming or not?" With an apologetic smile, Josephine hurried after her friends, leaving Fiona to contemplate the unexpected invitation. "I see you've met the town's social committee," Martha remarked dryly, approaching the counter once the door had closed. "Is Miss Thorpe always so insufferable?" "Yes, I'm afraid so. Her father indulges her every whim, and her mother passed when she was young, no one to teach her proper manners." Martha shook her head. "Josephine Wilson is a dear, though. Her family owns the largest cattle ranch in the county. Good people." Fiona nodded, returning to her inventory list. She invited us to their social next weekend. Martha looked surprised. Did she now? Well, that would be a fine opportunity for you to meet more of the townsfolk. We should make you a new dress for the occasion. Oh, that isn't necessary, nonsense. I won't have my kin attending a Wilson social in travel clothes. Besides, it will be good advertisement for the shop. Martha's tone brooked no argument. We'll start tomorrow. I'm thinking a green to complement your hair and bring out those lovely freckles. Fiona blinked in surprise. You think my freckles are lovely? Martha looked up from her sewing. Of course they are. They're part of who you are, Fiona. Never let anyone make you feel less because of how God made you. The rest of the afternoon passed without incident, though Fiona couldn't help but wonder if all of Whisperwood would share Florence Thorpe's opinion of her appearance. By closing time, her feet ached from standing, but she felt a sense of accomplishment at having survived her first day. As Martha locked the shop door, she noticed Marshal Wade across the street, speaking with a weathered-looking man on horseback. That's Jed Collins with the Marshal, Martha explained, following Fiona's gaze. He runs the stage line, probably discussing the schedule. The Marshal happened to glance their way and tipped his hat in greeting. Martha waved back cheerfully. Jackson Wade is a good man, she said as they turned toward the stairs leading to their quarters. This town's lucky to have him. He was a Texas Ranger before settling here 3 years ago. A Ranger? Fiona asked, intrigued despite herself. Martha nodded. Came highly recommended by the governor himself, from what I hear. Whisperwood was growing rough around the edges, too many cowhands with too much money after the cattle drives. The town council brought him in to establish some order. He seems competent, Fiona offered, remembering how efficiently he'd handled the drunken cowhands the previous day. Martha gave her a knowing look. He's also unmarried, if you're wondering. Plenty of local girls have set their caps for him, including Florence Thorpe, but he doesn't seem interested in settling down. I wasn't wondering anything of the sort, Fiona protested, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. Of course not, Martha replied with a smile that suggested she didn't believe a word of it. Now come along, I need your help with supper. The following days established a routine for Fiona. Mornings were spent helping Martha with the shop's operations, while afternoons were dedicated to assisting customers and working on her new dress for the social. Despite Florence Thorpe's initial unkindness, most of Whisperwood's citizens proved friendly enough, if curious about the newcomer. Occasionally, Marshal Wade would pass by the shop, tipping his hat politely if he happened to catch Fiona's eye through the window. Each time, she felt a curious flutter in her chest that she firmly attributed to gratitude for his earlier intervention. On Thursday afternoon, as Fiona was arranging a new display of ribbons in the window, the shop bell jingled. She turned to find Marshal Wade himself standing just inside the doorway, looking somewhat out of place among the feminine wares. Good afternoon, Marshal, she greeted him, smoothing her apron nervously. Can I help you with something? He removed his hat, revealing thick dark hair with hints of silver at the temples. Miss Murphy, I was hoping to speak with your cousin about a matter. Martha's just stepped out to deliver Mrs. Peterson's morning bonnet. She should return shortly if you'd like to wait. He nodded, shifting his weight slightly. That would be fine, thank you. An awkward silence fell between them. Fiona returned to her ribbons, acutely aware of his presence behind her. How are you finding Whisperwood? He asked finally. It's different from Missouri, she replied carefully. Smaller, but perhaps more lively. That's a diplomatic answer, he observed with a hint of amusement. Fiona turned to face him fully. Would you prefer honesty, Marshal? Always. She hesitated, then decided to speak plainly. Very well. I find Whisperwood to be like most small towns, quick to notice differences and slow to accept them. Some people have been kind, others less so. But I've only been here a few days, so perhaps my judgment is premature. He studied her thoughtfully. You're referring to Florence Thorpe and her friends. Fiona's eyebrows rose in surprise. How did you small town? He reminded her with a slight smile. And Florence isn't known for her subtlety. Apparently not, Fiona agreed dryly. Miss Thorpe represents a certain type found in every town, he continued. People who believe their worth comes from diminishing others. I wouldn't take her comments to heart. I learned long ago not to measure my value by others' opinions, Marshal. Something like admiration flickered in his eyes. That's a rare quality, Miss Murphy. The door opened before she could respond, and Martha entered, looking surprised to find the Marshal in her shop. Marshal Wade. This is unexpected. Is everything all right? Everything's fine, Mrs. Calloway. I wanted to discuss security arrangements for the Wilson social. With so many ranchers in one place, it might tempt troublemakers. Of course, Martha nodded. Fiona, would you mind watching the front while the Marshal and I talk? Fiona agreed, returning to her display work as Martha led Marshal Wade to the back of the shop. Their conversation was too quiet to overhear, but occasionally she caught the Marshal glancing in her direction, his expression thoughtful. When he left a short while later, he paused at the door. Miss Murphy, I understand you'll be attending the Wilsons' social on Saturday. Yes, Martha insisted, she replied. He nodded, seeming pleased. Then I'll see you there. Good day, Miss Murphy. As the door closed behind him, Martha emerged from the back, a knowing smile on her face. Well, well. Well, what? Fiona asked defensively. Nothing, dear. Just observing that our Marshal seemed quite interested in your attendance at the social. He's probably concerned about security for all guests, Fiona countered, busying herself with straightening a stack of handkerchiefs. Hum, Martha hummed skeptically. I'm sure that's it entirely. Fiona changed the subject deliberately. How is my dress coming along? Should we work on the hem tonight? Martha allowed the diversion with good grace. Yes, and we should decide on your hairstyle as well. First impressions at social gatherings are important, you know. I thought I already made my first impression when I arrived, Fiona remarked. That was just the preview, dear, Martha replied with a wink. Saturday will be the main event. The Wilson Ranch lay 3 miles outside of Whisperwood Creek, a sprawling property that spoke of generations of prosperity. The main house was an impressive 2-story structure with a wide veranda wrapping around 3 sides. Lanterns were strung between posts, casting a warm glow over the gathering as dusk approached. Martha had arranged for them to ride out with the blacksmith and his wife, who owned a small buggy. Fiona sat nervously in the back, conscious of how the emerald green dress Martha had created emphasized her figure in a way her usual attire did not. Her auburn hair was arranged in an elegant twist, with a few curls framing her face. You look lovely, Martha had assured her before they left the shop. Those freckles are like cinnamon dusted over cream, absolutely charming. Fiona wished she shared her cousin's confidence. As the buggy pulled up to the hitching post in front of the Wilson home, she spotted several familiar faces from town, including Florence Thorpe and her circle of friends. They were gathered near the entrance, clearly evaluating each new arrival. Remember to stand straight, Martha murmured as they approached. You have nothing to be ashamed of. Josephine Wilson greeted them warmly at the door. Mrs. Calloway, Miss Murphy, I'm so pleased you could come. Please help yourselves to refreshments in the parlor. We'll have dancing in the barn once everyone arrives. Fiona followed Martha into the spacious home, where various townspeople stood in conversational clusters. Several heads turned as they entered, and she heard the familiar whispers that seemed to follow her everywhere. That's the Murphy girl. Look at her face, all those spots. Martha says they're freckles, runs in the family, never seen so many, poor thing. Fiona kept her expression neutral, though her stomach twisted with familiar discomfort. Martha steered her toward the refreshment table, where punch and various cakes were arranged on a lace-covered table. Mrs. Calloway, good evening, a deep voice greeted them. Fiona turned to find Marshal Wade standing nearby, dressed in clean dark trousers and a pressed white shirt, his usual leather vest replaced by a proper waistcoat. Without his hat, his dark hair was neatly combed, making him look younger somehow. Marshal, Martha smiled. Don't you clean up nicely? He nodded in acknowledgement, then turned to Fiona. Miss Murphy, that's a fine dress you're wearing. Thank you, she replied. Martha made it. You do excellent work, Mrs. Calloway, he said, though his eyes remained on Fiona. Martha beamed. The fabric does half the work when you have the right person wearing it. Now, if you'll excuse me, I see Mrs. Peterson waving me over. Something about that bonnet, no doubt." She departed with a meaningful glance at Fiona that clearly said, "Make conversation." Left alone with the marshal, Fiona searched for something appropriate to say. He saved her the trouble. "Would you care to walk on the veranda, Miss Murphy? It's rather crowded in here." She nodded gratefully, and he offered his arm, leading her through the crowd toward the front door. She was acutely aware of the eyes following them, particularly Florence Thorpe's narrowed gaze. The evening air was cool and refreshing after the stuffy interior. Several couples were already enjoying the veranda's relative privacy, speaking in hushed tones in the shadows between lanterns. "I imagine social gatherings were quite different in Missouri," Marshal Wade commented as they walked. "Not so different," Fiona replied. "People are much the same everywhere, I find, only the scenery changes." He chuckled. "That's a wise observation." They reached the far end of the veranda, where a bench sat partially concealed by a climbing rose. He gestured to it questioningly, and she nodded, grateful to rest her feet. The new shoes Martha had insisted on were not fully broken in. "I've noticed you don't wear a bonnet like most ladies," he remarked after they were seated. Fiona touched her face self-consciously. "I used to back home to hide. Well, you can see why." He studied her face openly in the lantern light. "Your freckles. Yes, why hide them?" The directness of his question caught her off guard. "Because people stare. They make comments. They laugh." His expression darkened. "People can be cruel about things they don't understand or appreciate. And what do you understand about freckles, Marshal Wade?" She asked, more sharply than intended. He didn't seem offended by her tone. Instead, he looked out toward the distant hills, now mere silhouettes against the darkening sky. "I understand that they're like stars brought down to earth," he said quietly. "Scattered across your skin by the same hand that hung the constellations." Fiona's breath caught in her throat. No one had ever described her freckles in such a way. "That's poetic for a lawman," she managed finally. A smile quirked at the corner of his mouth. "Even lawmen can appreciate beauty, Miss Murphy." Before she could formulate a response, the sound of a fiddle tuning up came from the direction of the barn. "Sounds like the dancing is about to begin," he said, rising and offering his hand. "Would you do me the honor of the first dance?" Fiona hesitated. "People will talk if you single me out." "Let them," he replied simply. "I've never much cared for gossip." Something about his quiet confidence gave her courage. She placed her hand in his and allowed him to escort her toward the barn, where lanterns hung from the rafters and hay bales had been arranged around a cleared space for dancing. As they entered, several conversations paused. Florence Thorpe, standing with a group near the makeshift refreshment table, made no attempt to hide her disapproval. "Looks like the Marshal's charity extends to dance partners," she remarked loudly enough to be heard over the fiddle's warm-up notes. Fiona tensed, but Marshal Wade's hand remained steady at her elbow. "Miss Thorpe," he greeted the banker's daughter with cool politeness. "Enjoying the evening?" Florence's smile was tight. "I was until certain elements arrived." "Then perhaps you should leave," he suggested mildly. "If the company displeases you." Several onlookers gasped at the public rebuke. Florence's face flushed with humiliation. "You would choose her over me?" she demanded, gesturing toward Fiona's freckled face. "Look at her. She's covered in spots like some kind of leopard." The cruelty of the comment hung in the air. Fiona wanted nothing more than to flee, but Marshal Wade's hand tightened slightly on her elbow, keeping her in place. When he spoke, his voice carried throughout the now silent barn. "Those freckles you mock, Miss Thorpe, are the brightest thing in this town. They outshine your father's money, your fine dresses, and certainly your disposition." Florence's mouth opened and closed wordlessly. The marshal turned to Fiona, his expression softening. "Miss Murphy, I believe they're playing our dance." Indeed, the fiddler had begun a lively reel. Without waiting for further discussion, he led her to the center of the floor and bowed formally. Fiona curtsied in return, her heart hammering against her ribs. As they joined hands for the dance, he leaned close enough for only her to hear. "I meant what I said, Fiona, every word. The use of her given name should have shocked her, but somehow it felt right in that moment. She met his gaze directly, allowing a small smile to form on her lips. "Thank you, Jackson." They moved through the steps of the dance with surprising harmony, and gradually other couples joined them on the floor. Florence Thorpe and her friends retreated to a corner, their influence momentarily diminished by the marshal's public rebuke. "You shouldn't have done that," Fiona said as they circled each other in the dance. "Her father is an important man in town." "I'm not concerned with William Thorpe's opinion," Jackson replied, and his daughter needed a reminder about civility. Still, to say such things in public. Were they untrue? She met his gaze again, finding nothing but sincerity there. "No one has ever defended me that way before." "Then everyone you've known has failed you," he said simply. The dance ended too soon, and other partners claimed them for subsequent rounds. Fiona found herself dancing with Josephine Wilson's brother, the blacksmith, and several ranchers, all of whom treated her with newfound respect. Word of the marshal's declaration had spread quickly, elevating Fiona's status in a way she'd never experienced. Later, as the evening wound down, she found herself once again on the veranda with Jackson, watching as guests began departing in buggies and on horseback. "I should find Martha," she said reluctantly. "Our ride will be leaving soon." "Allow me to drive you both home," he offered. "My buggy is more comfortable than sharing with the blacksmith and his wife." "That's very kind, but please," he interrupted gently, "it would be my pleasure." Something in his expression, a mixture of hope and determination, made refusal impossible. "I'll tell Martha of the change in plans." She found her cousin inside, deep in conversation with Mrs. Wilson about fabric for new curtains. Martha readily agreed to the marshal's offer of transportation, with a knowing smile that made Fiona blush. The ride back to Whisperwood was quiet but comfortable. Martha, claiming fatigue, sat in the back of the buggy, leaving Fiona beside Jackson on the front bench. The night air was cool, and he draped a blanket across their laps without comment. "I hope Florence's behavior didn't spoil your evening," he said as they traveled the moonlit road. "On the contrary," Fiona replied, "it led to one of the most memorable moments of my life." He glanced at her, a question in his eyes. "No one has ever stood up for me that way," she explained. "It was remarkable." "It shouldn't be," he said firmly. "You deserve better than mockery for something as natural and beautiful as your freckles." From the back seat, Martha let out what sounded suspiciously like a snort of amusement, quickly disguised as a cough. When they reached the dress shop, Jackson insisted on seeing both women safely inside before bidding them good night. At the door, he hesitated, then spoke quietly to Fiona. "Would you consider taking a Sunday drive with me tomorrow, after church services?" Martha immediately answered for her. "She'd be delighted, Marshal. Wouldn't you, Fiona?" Fiona shot her cousin an exasperated look before turning back to Jackson. "Yes, I would like that very much." His smile was worth any amount of Martha's teasing. "I'll come by at 2 o'clock then. Good night, ladies." As they watched him return to his buggy, Martha nudged Fiona's shoulder playfully. "I told you the social would be the main event." "Oh, hush," Fiona replied, but she couldn't keep the smile from her face. Sunday dawned bright and clear, a perfect day for a drive in the country. Fiona attended church services with Martha, trying to ignore the curious glances and whispers that followed her. Word of the marshal's declaration at the Wilson social had spread throughout Whisperwood, creating a minor sensation. Josephine Wilson made a point of sitting beside Fiona during the service, a gesture of friendship that did not go unnoticed. Even more surprising, several other young women who had previously ignored her now offered smiles and greetings. "It's amazing how people's attitudes change when the town marshal shows interest," Martha observed dryly as they walked home after the service. "Is that all it is?" Fiona asked, troubled by the thought. "His position rather than any genuine change of heart," Martha patted her arm. "People are complicated, dear. Some follow the marshal's lead because they respect him, others because they fear crossing him. A few because they're genuinely ashamed of their previous behavior. The reason matters less than the result, in my opinion." Fiona wasn't entirely convinced, but she had no time to dwell on it. She needed to prepare for her drive with Jackson. At precisely 2 o'clock, he arrived at the dress shop, wearing his Sunday best and driving a freshly polished buggy. Martha practically pushed Fiona out the door with a basket of refreshments for your outing and a reminder not to stay out after dark. "Your cousin is not subtle," Jackson remarked as he helped Fiona into the buggy. "Martha believes in being direct," Fiona agreed, settling her skirts. "She also believes in feeding people. There's enough food in this basket for 5, he chuckled as he took his seat beside her. "Then we won't go hungry. I thought we might drive out to Clearwater Creek. It's about 4 miles east, a pretty spot for a picnic." As they left Whisperwood behind, Fiona felt herself relaxing. Jackson was easy to talk with, asking thoughtful questions about her life in Missouri and sharing stories of his own experiences as a Texas Ranger. "What made you decide to become a marshal after being a ranger?" she asked as they traveled the winding dirt road toward Clearwater Creek. He was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "I saw too much violence with the Rangers, necessary work but hard on the soul. I wanted something steadier, a place to build something lasting." "And you chose Whisperwood," he nodded. "It had potential. Good people for the most part, just needed someone to maintain order so commerce could flourish." "You make it sound so practical," Fiona observed, "as though you were simply making a business decision." Jackson glanced at her, a smile tugging at his lips. "Would you prefer a more romantic reason? Perhaps I was following a star that led me to this particular town," Fiona laughed. "Now you're mocking me." "Never," he replied, his expression turning serious. "I don't believe in mocking what matters." The intensity of his gaze made her heart skip a beat, and she looked away, focusing on the landscape rolling past. The Texas Panhandle had its own stark beauty, different from Missouri's lush hills, but compelling in its vastness. They reached Clearwater Creek, a surprisingly verdant oasis where a small stream had carved a path through the prairie. Cottonwood trees provided shade along the banks, and wildflowers dotted the surrounding grass. Jackson helped her down from the buggy and spread a blanket beneath the largest cottonwood. They unpacked Martha's generous basket, finding fried chicken, biscuits, apple pie, and a jar of lemonade. "Your cousin should open a restaurant," Jackson commented after sampling the chicken. "Don't suggest it," Fiona warned. "She's ambitious enough to try, and then I'd be running the dress shop alone." They ate companionably, the conversation flowing easily between them. Fiona found herself sharing things she'd rarely spoken of: her mother's early death, her father's struggle to maintain their farm, the isolation she'd felt growing up with her distinctive appearance. "Children were the cruelest," she admitted, tracing patterns on the blanket with her finger. "They called me Spotted Fiona and refused to play with me. As I grew older, the boys would pretend to court me as a joke, seeing who could maintain the charade longest before revealing the prank." Jackson's expression darkened. "No wonder you're cautious about people's intentions." She glanced up, startled by his perception. "Yes, I suppose I am. I want you to know that what I said at the social wasn't impulsive or insincere," he said, holding her gaze steadily. "I've thought you remarkable since the moment I saw you, because of my freckles." She asked, half joking to hide her uncertainty. "Because of your dignity," he corrected. "The way you held yourself when those cowhands accosted you, the way you faced Florence Thorpe's pettiness without lowering yourself to her level. Your freckles are beautiful, yes, but they're merely the visible sign of something rarer, a spirit that refuses to be diminished by others' narrow vision." Fiona found herself at a loss for words, moved by the sincerity in his voice. "I've embarrassed you," he said, misinterpreting her silence. "No," she managed finally. "You've honored me. There's a difference." He smiled then, and something shifted between them, a recognition of mutual understanding that needed no further words. They finished their meal in comfortable silence, listening to the creek's gentle murmur and the rustling leaves overhead. As they packed up to return to town, Jackson hesitated, then reached out to touch one of the curls that had escaped Fiona's careful arrangement. "May I call on you again?" he asked quietly. "Yes," she replied without hesitation. "I'd like that very much." The drive back to Whisperwood seemed shorter somehow, filled with a new awareness of each other. When they reached the dress shop, Jackson walked her to the door, carrying the picnic basket. "Thank you for a lovely afternoon," Fiona said, suddenly shy now that they were back in town, where curious eyes might be watching from behind curtained windows. "The pleasure was mine," he replied formally, though his eyes conveyed a warmer message. "Good evening, Miss Murphy." "Good evening, Marshal Wade." Martha was waiting inside, pretending to be absorbed in account books but clearly bursting with curiosity. "Well, how was your drive?" "Pleasant," Fiona replied noncommittally, hanging up her shawl. "Pleasant," Martha echoed incredulously. "The Marshal looks at you like you hung the moon, takes you on a private picnic, and all you can say is pleasant." Fiona couldn't suppress her smile any longer. "Very pleasant, then." Martha threw up her hands in mock exasperation. "You young people and your restraint. In my day, we weren't afraid to admit when we were sweet on someone." "And who says I'm sweet on the Marshal?" Fiona countered, though her burning cheeks betrayed her. "Your face says it plain as day, my dear," Martha replied triumphantly. "Those freckles can't hide a blush." Over the following weeks, Jackson became a regular visitor at the dress shop. Sometimes he brought small gifts, wildflowers gathered from the prairie, a book of poetry he thought she might enjoy, or candy from the general store. Other times he simply stopped by to check on their well-being, a courtesy he extended to all businesses in town but lingered over at Martha's establishment. Florence Thorpe and her friends maintained a cool distance, but their open mockery had ceased following the Marshal's public rebuke. Josephine Wilson, by contrast, had become a genuine friend, visiting the shop frequently and inviting Fiona to various social gatherings. By the time autumn painted the cottonwoods gold, Fiona had established herself as a respected member of Whisperwood society. Her skill with a needle rivaled Martha's, and customers increasingly requested her work specifically. The freckles that had once been a source of ridicule were now considered a distinguishing feature, like the Marshal said, the brightest thing in town, people would remark, usually within earshot. One crisp October evening, as Fiona was closing the shop, Jackson arrived with his buggy. "I know it's short notice," he said apologetically, "but there's something I'd like to show you if you're not too tired." Martha practically pushed her out the door. "Go on, I can finish up here." The air held the promise of winter as they drove out of town, heading west toward the setting sun. Jackson was uncharacteristically quiet, responding to Fiona's questions with distracted smiles. "Is something wrong?" she finally asked directly. "Nothing's wrong," he assured her. "Just thinking about the future." Before she could press for clarification, he pointed ahead. "There it is." Fiona followed his gesture to where a small house stood on a gentle rise, outlined against the sunset. It was a simple structure, a cabin really, with a covered porch and a stone chimney. The windows caught the fading sunlight, glowing like amber. "It's lovely," she said, genuinely admiring the picturesque setting. "Who lives there?" "No one at present," he replied, guiding the buggy up the winding path to the house. "I purchased it last spring from a rancher who decided to move to California." He helped her down and led her onto the porch. "It needs work," he acknowledged, gesturing to the weathered boards and peeling paint, "but the structure is sound." Fiona was puzzled by his apparent nervousness as he opened the door and ushered her inside. The interior was simple but spacious, a main room with a stone fireplace, a separate kitchen area, and doors leading to what she presumed were bedrooms. "It's very nice," she said, still confused about why he'd brought her here. Jackson moved to the fireplace, running his hand along the rough-hewn mantel. "I've been thinking about what I want for my future," he said, his back to her, "about what would make this place a home." He turned to face her then, his expression more vulnerable than she'd ever seen it. "I thought perhaps some curtains at the windows, a woman's touch to soften the edges." Fiona's heart began to race as understanding dawned. "Curtains would certainly help," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. He crossed the room to stand before her, taking both her hands in his. "Fiona Murphy, I find myself in the unusual position of being the Marshal who can't enforce his own heart's law. It refuses to maintain order, insists on racing whenever you're near." A smile tugged at her lips. That sounds serious, Marshal. Perhaps you should resign. I'm considering a different solution, he replied, his thumbs gently caressing her knuckles, one that would require your cooperation. Oh. He took a deep breath. I love you, Fiona, your strength, your kindness, your determination, the way you see beauty in this harsh land, the way you've faced every challenge with grace. And yes, those remarkable freckles that were the first thing I noticed about you and still enchant me daily. Tears welled in her eyes as he continued. I'm asking if you would consider becoming my wife, living here with me, turning this house into our home, growing old together under this Texas sky. For a moment, Fiona couldn't speak past the emotion closing her throat. When she finally found her voice, it emerged steady and clear. I would consider it, she said formally, then broke into a radiant smile. In fact, I've already considered it and reached a favorable conclusion. Joy transformed his face. Is that a yes? Yes, Jackson Wade, I will marry you. He gathered her into his arms then, his kiss conveying everything words could not promise, passion and the certainty of a shared future. When they finally parted, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. I should tell you, he said quietly, that being a marshal's wife won't always be easy. There are dangers, she placed her finger against his lips. I'm not marrying the marshal, I'm marrying the man, the one who saw past appearances to something deeper. The one who called my Freckles stars brought down to earth. He captured her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. I meant every word. I know, she replied simply, that's why I love you. As dusk deepened into evening, they sat on the porch of what would become their home, planning their future together. Fiona leaned against Jackson's shoulder, gazing up at the emerging stars. Do you think Martha will be upset that I'm leaving the shop? She asked suddenly. Jackson chuckled. Martha has been plotting this outcome since your first week in Whisperwood. I suspect she'll be insufferably pleased with herself. She did seem rather eager to push me out the door tonight, Fiona admitted with a laugh, almost as if she knew. She may have had an inkling, he conceded. I might have mentioned my intentions when I asked for your hand yesterday. Fiona sat up straight. You asked Martha for my hand, but I'm not it seemed the proper thing to do, he explained. She is your closest relative, after all. And what did she say? That if I didn't propose soon, she'd do it for me. His eyes crinkled with amusement. Your cousin is not a patient woman. No, Fiona agreed, settling back against him, but she has excellent judgment in matters of the heart, it seems. They married in November, with the entire town in attendance. Even Florence Thorpe came, though she remained at the back of the church and left before the reception. Josephine Wilson served as Fiona's maid of honor, while the county sheriff stood as Jackson's best man. Martha wept openly during the ceremony, proudly telling anyone who would listen that she had orchestrated the whole romance from the beginning. Saw it coming the moment he defended her freckles, she declared. Knew right then they were meant for each other. Their home on the rise became a warm haven, known for its hospitality, and the curtains that Fiona had indeed sewn for every window. Jackson continued as marshal, bringing law and order to Whisperwood with a firm but fair hand. Fiona established a small dressmaking business from their home, catering to clients who didn't mind the short ride out of town for her exceptional work. By the following spring, Fiona's slender figure had begun to round with the promise of their first child. Jackson became even more protective, checking on her multiple times throughout the day and insisting she rest frequently. I'm carrying a baby, not a china doll, she reminded him one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the prairie in gold and crimson. Our baby, he corrected, placing his hand reverently on her growing belly. The greatest treasure Whisperwood has ever seen. Greater than my freckles, she teased. He pretended to consider this seriously. Equal to, perhaps, I wonder if our child will have them too. Would you mind if she did? Fiona asked, suddenly serious. Jackson lifted her chin gently, meeting her gaze. I would consider it a blessing, a visible reminder of her remarkable mother, or his, Fiona amended. It could be a boy. Boy or girl, freckled or not, this child will be loved beyond measure, Jackson promised, and will grow up knowing that true beauty is found in character, not in meeting others' expectations. Fiona leaned against his shoulder, contentment washing over her. When I first arrived in Whisperwood, I never imagined finding this kind of happiness. I was just hoping to survive. And now I'm thriving, she said simply, with a man who sees constellations where others saw only spots. Who taught me that sometimes the very thing we're most ashamed of can be our greatest beauty in the right eyes. Jackson kissed her temple tenderly. Not just in my eyes, Fiona Wade, you've won over the entire town with your grace and strength. Those freckles are just the outward sign of an inner light that would shine through any skin. As night fell over their little home on the prairie, Fiona reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment, from a friendless girl in Missouri to a beloved wife in Texas. From hiding her face in shame to wearing her freckles with pride. All because one man had the vision to see beauty where others saw only difference. "What are you thinking about?" Jackson asked, noticing her contemplative silence. "About how a single moment can change everything," she replied. "If those cowhands hadn't accosted me my first day in town, if you hadn't intervened, I would have found another way to meet you," he assured her confidently. "Some things are meant to be, Fiona, like freckles on your skin, like stars in the sky. Like us," she finished softly. "Exactly like us," he agreed, drawing her closer as the first stars appeared overhead, mirroring the constellations he had long ago discovered on her skin, both of them bright against the darkness, both of them enduring, both of them exactly where they were meant to be. Their daughter was born in late summer, a healthy, strong, lunged girl with a spattering of freckles across her tiny nose. They named her Stella, for the stars that had brought them together, and raised her to see beauty in differences and strength in kindness. As the years passed, Whisperwood grew from a frontier outpost to a proper town. The railroad finally came through in 1879, bringing new prosperity and opportunities. Jackson eventually retired as marshal to raise cattle on the land surrounding their home, which had expanded to include a proper ranch house, as their family grew to include 2 more children, twin boys, who inherited their mother's auburn hair, but their father's clear complexion. Through it all, Fiona's freckles remained fading slightly with age, but still visible, still distinctive, still the first thing Jackson kissed each morning when they woke, and the last thing he touched each night before sleep claimed them. "The brightest thing in town," he would still say, even decades later when silver threaded their hair and life had etched its own marks upon their faces. "The map that led me home." And Fiona, who had once hidden those marks in shame, would smile and thank the fortune that had brought her to Whisperwood Creek, where a man with the vision to see beyond appearances had transformed her greatest insecurity into her most treasured attribute, not through magic or miracle, but through the simple, profound power of loving truly.